This is what is termed a quasi-judicial meeting, which means that members sit not as ward councillors, but as representatives of the council as a whole. No decisions have been made before this meeting, and only members who have completed the mandatory training are able to vote. And I confirm that all members present have completed that mandatory training. Excuse me. We've also got people here who have stated that they wish to speak on a number of planning applications. We deal with those planning applications on an area basis, and I'll introduce those people at the relevant time. And just to remind the people that your contribution should be limited to 3 minutes. If there are more than if there's more than one speaker speaking, your total time is 3 minutes, and how you divide that between yourselves is up to you. Can I remind everyone present that to switch off your mobile phones, and also remind councillors that you don't enjoy parliamentary privilege, so please be aware of that when speaking. And we're on to item 1 of the agenda, which is to notify everyone that today's meeting is being filmed and live streamed on the web. Item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest today? There being none, can I move to item 3? Apologies. I think there are apologies from Councillor Mumtaz Hussain and Councillor Diane Donaldson. Receive those? Chair's announcements. I don't have any. The minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of February. Is it agreed I confirm and sign them as a correct record? Are you agree with that? Thank you. So we're on to reports for the South area, and the first report is the report on 2 to 10 Bourne Brook Road. So can I first of all ask the area planning manager for any updates?
No updates on this one, Chair. Thank you.
Fine. So we do have an objector on that. Can I invite Andrew Schofield from the Community Partnership for Selly Oak to address the committee? And as I said, you've got 3 minutes when you're ready.
Chairman, councillors, I speak on behalf of the Community Partnership for Selly Oak, a federation of local residents groups, including the Selly Park Property Owners Association. I also indirectly represent 52 local residents who submitted letters of objection in regard to this development. The demolition of 2 to 10 Bourne Brook Road has major implications for the Selly Oak district that extend far beyond the boundaries of the property. First, this scheme is disingenuous at every level. It does not in fact propose demolition of numbers 2 to 4 Bourne Brook Road and the redevelopment of numbers 6 to 10. Rather, the only parts of 6 to 10 that will remain are the door numbers themselves. Every brick in these terrace properties will be removed. Indeed, the rear half has already been demolished. Numbers 6 to 10 may be replaced by cluster flats with layouts approximating terrace housing, but they will be 4 stories high and flat roofed. And the top story will be linked to the adjacent student hall, such that it will not even belong to the so-called terrace properties beneath it. What is presented, therefore, is the total destruction of 2 to 10 to be replaced by a 4-story hall of residence that is totally out of keeping with the remaining neighbouring 2-story houses that it touches. Second, this development is acknowledged by your officers to impact on the Selly Park conservation area and the listed buildings on the university campus. Cited as an entranceway to Selly Park, you must regard this development as a gateway feature, setting the tone for the conservation area itself, and in doing so should rate its impact on the area as considerable. Bourne Brook Road is also offers a unique view of the campus. Thus, any impact on the view of the listed buildings therein for the many hundreds of daily visitors approaching from this direction must also be deemed considerable, even if the hands of the clock tower remain visible above the modern facade of this development. In its context, this design is unacceptable. Third, your officers support this proposal on the ground of student demand. The updated supply and demand paper for purpose-built student accommodation suggests a shortfall of just over 15,000 bed spaces in Selly Oak and Edgbaston.
1 minute left.
Which, if true, would indeed be of concern. However, this figure assumes that all students want to live in halls and residence. They do not. In fact, taking all forms of accommodation into account, there is a citywide surplus of around 9,000 student beds. No student is homeless. Finally, this development exposes the myth that halls of residence will magically liberate HMOs back into the residential market. Here we see traditional houses condemned as having no hope of ever returning to residential accommodation. And mark my words, if this development is permitted, it will not be the last to see traditional terrace houses ripped down to make way for student halls. Most of the hundreds of student HMOs in Selly Oak are owned by large-scale property developers who will gladly convert street after street into ad hoc student accommodation without a moment's thought for the occasional residential house that gets sandwiched in between. Councillors, I urge you to reject this application.
Thank you, Mr. Schofield. Can I bring the area planning manager comment before I throw it on to members for discussion?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the speaker there. Just talking to the issue of need for student accommodation as the one of the first issues. This report and other reports on the agenda today and the paper that was presented earlier in the year to you clearly show that there is a need for more student accommodation in the Selly Oak and Edgbaston area. The applicants are providing their own figures, and within the report you see the extract of the report to you earlier this year. It's clear that there is that need, and we certainly couldn't sustain a reason for refusal based on that particular issue. The schemes for a relatively small number of units, 69 bed spaces, and the report clearly shows that there's a large undersupply, and that takes into account HMOs as well. So you can see within the table that there are HMOs within the area. They're taken into account in terms of the supply and demand. It couldn't be a better located site in terms of its access to the university. It's right opposite the university gates. So in respect of the policies that you have, TP 33, we think that it's fully in compliance with that. Just looking at the site as it is at the moment, we've got 5 terrace properties. They are currently in use as HMOs. So we do not have a loss of family dwellings or dwellings that are in use at the moment as HMOs. All of them have been given permission to do extensions, rear extensions, and also to insert roof lights. So the assumption is that even if this scheme wasn't given approval, they would implement larger extensions and increase the intensity of the use of those particular HMOs. And in fact, looking at those plans and adding up the potential number of occupiers that there could be in those 5 properties, if they implemented those extensions, that comes to 32 bed spaces. So even without this redevelopment of the site, it's clear that those properties are highly likely to stay in use as HMOs and probably more intensively used in the future. So that deals with the issue of need. Just turning to the issue of the loss of the buildings and the heritage impacts. The terrace houses themselves have no statutory protection. They're not listed or locally listed. They're not in the conservation area. So they have no statutory protection from demolition. So what we need to look at is the redevelopment and the impact that that has on the adjacent properties. That's on the other side of not themselves in. We've acknowledged within the report that our conservation officer does have some concerns, particularly around the proposed scale, being 3 to 4 stories rather than the 2 stories and 2+ dormers that some of the properties do have on Bourne Brook Road. So they clearly will have a greater height. And I think that the first page of the report, you can see the image there. We, as officers, are comfortable with that scale. We think that it's a good transition between the existing 2-storey terrace properties coming around the corner onto Bristol Road, which is obviously one of our key arterial routes, and having some more scale on that road to us is more than appropriate. There are other examples close by of 4-storey properties on Bristol Road with student accommodation. So although we've acknowledged that there is a low level of harm to the setting of the adjacent conservation area, we don't think that that would the balance of the number of units being provided, the need that we've got for student accommodation, and the general need that we've got for housing in the city. And once you apply that tilted balance, obviously advised you in the past that we tip the balance into a recommendation for approval. Just picking up the detailed point about impact of views of the clock tower on the university campus. Obviously, that's very important in terms of the long views and the short views of that listed structure. We've looked carefully at that with the applicant and with our conservation officer. And the view is that just putting those 2 additional stories on would not cause substantial harm to those views. And it's only very limited views from the road looking across toward, and it would be obscuring lower levels of the tower rather than the whole of it. So again, the conservation officer is comfortable with that. So I think when we're looking at the scheme in the round, I think it's a very positive scheme. It satisfies the need for student accommodation. It's on a site that's already got HMOs on it. It's a relatively small scale scheme when you think of some of the schemes that obviously we've presented to you in this area and in Edgbaston and the rest of the city. I think it's well designed. We've been through a lot of negotiations with the applicant in terms of the materiality, the articulation of the building. It's a high quality scheme. We fully recommend the scheme to you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to throw it open to members of the committee for discussion. Councillor Green.
Thank you, Chair. As has been said, this is the perfect location for student accommodation. It's right opposite the gate of the university. The scale of the building is not out of proportion with FEMA studios and the new studio and even the house across the road. The increased density will, in a tiny amount, relieve pressure on their housing behind. There is a forlorn hope that this area will return to family housing. I think it's an entirely appropriate application.
Thank you. Councillor Marsham.
Chair, I'd like to speak as well. I think this is the demand in our city for more purpose-built student accommodation, and this is literally on the doorstep of UOB. The loss of a small number of terraces, though, is regrettable, but they're currently HMOs anyway. So the more purpose-built student accommodation that is built means long-term we can get more homes back to families instead of being student HMOs.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on this report? I'm going to put this to the vote then. The recommendations are listed in 9 with a number of conditions. All those in favour?
10.
10?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that is carried unanimously, approved subject to the conditions listed in the report. Thank you. Move on to item 7, which is the report on the former Trees public house site, Bristol Road. Are there any updates on this report?
Yes, one update, Chair, just one additional letter of objection stating that there's no need for student accommodation. The amended plans are not an improvement. Tall buildings should be on the McDonald's site and loss of general amenity for residents. And those are all issues covered in the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We have speakers on this report. The first one is Councillor Matt Bennett, objector.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm speaking on behalf of residents in Edgbaston, the community of Edgbaston, which obviously naturally I consider to be one of the great assets of this city with its conservation area. And developments like this one chip away at that over time and have done over a long period of time. And they also reduce the kind of number of permanent residents of the area, increases the transient population, which is not to the benefit of the area. Now, much of the reason for the objection of the previous version of this report was to do with the impact on the conservation area. And that is covered in the report here. And that impact is still there. The size of the tallest tower has been reduced. but as we can see, it still has a detrimental impact on the conservation area. I can refer members to paragraph 7.59, which the report writer actually takes a stronger view than the conservation officer about the impact on the conservation area. It says the urban character not currently noticeable to the east would start to diminish the understanding, appreciation and experience of suburban context, still appreciable in these views from Spring Road and within the immediate streetscape setting of the listed buildings. The report then goes on to suggest that despite this, it considers the benefits outweigh the impact on the conservation area. I would have to disagree. I think we place not enough value on our conservation areas in this city. And as I say, it begins to undermine the character of the area. These tall buildings are not in keeping with the houses, with the listed buildings that are nearby. Now, there are some questions about whether this is the right location, about whether it's really needed. I would have to say it's too far from the University of Birmingham. A previous version of this report did have a statement in there that said that the University of Birmingham considered that it was in the wrong location. It is some distance from there, and indeed from Birmingham City University. So I think this is not needed. I think that in Edgbaston Ward, we have a great number of student bed space already. We don't need any more. I would also like to turn to the issue of parking. There is nowhere near sufficient parking here. I understand the aspiration there would be no cars. There's something in the lease agreement, apparently, that would prevent students from owning cars. But behind this, there's an estate where there are no parking restrictions. I would suggest it's not in anyone's interest, certainly not in the developer's interest, to enforce that in any way. If people are parking there, they've got no way of knowing. They've got no access to the DVLA database. They're not going to run to take enforcement, and residents probably won't know to report it to them. There's going to be more parking restrictions needed there. I think if this is approved, I hope it's not, but if it is, I think the developers should pay for that, because otherwise the council will have to. Thank you.
I invite Janet Rowley from Lichfields to speak.
As you may already be aware, the proposals in front of you today are the culmination of extensive work between the applicant and your officers to address concerns raised in respect of heritage impacts, which the previous proposal for the site was refused. The applicant team, in liaison with your officers and statutory consultees, have listened to those concerns and significantly revised the proposal. This has resulted in a significant reduction in height, reducing the tallest element from 26 stories to 17 stories. Your conservation officer finds, as a result, that there is now no harm to the Edgbaston conservation area. Similarly, the proposed buildings would not be visible in the views of listed dwellings on Wellington Road, thereby causing no harm. Its visibility will be greatly reduced in views from Spring Road, and importantly, the building would be consistent with height, scale and massing of those around it in the vicinity of Belgrave Middleway, a key gateway into the city centre. The principle of student accommodation on this site is supported by your officers, as it will make a meaningful contribution towards meeting the need of purpose-built accommodation arising from University of Birmingham, a need that has been identified by the Council's 2022 and 2023 student accommodation supply and demand papers. Without meeting this need, the demand for HMO accommodation in areas such as Selly Oak will continue to grow. This proposal is a crucial part of controlling the blight of more family homes being converted into HMOs and the impacts on residents in those areas. The gateway location of the application site benefits from excellent transport links provided by Bristol Road and Leebank Middleway in terms of pedestrian, cycle and public transport connections to the University of Birmingham and the city centre itself. It is well located for students. Importantly, the proposal will finally deliver the regeneration of a highly visible site, a site that has been vacant and a blight to this prominent street scene for 20 years. The proposal will also bring with it economic benefits such as direct job creation during construction and operation, and associated supply chain jobs, investment and expenditure into the local economy. The accommodation and facilities will be of very high quality and strict management will be in place. Students will be prohibited from having cars as set out in their tenancy agreement. This is actively monitored and enforced by Fusion, who operate a zero tolerance policy in this regard. Tenancies will be terminated if students break this rule. This is a much needed and carefully considered scheme which addresses the issues raised in respect of the previous application for this site. We hope that you are able to support your officer's recommendation for approval and the substantive benefits which will accrue from the development. Thank you.
I ask the area planning manager to respond before I throw it out.
I understood that especially BR was slated to speak on behalf of the residents as well. Can you confirm that?
I'm sorry that person wasn't on my list of speakers, and the 3 minutes has actually been taken up by someone else. Sorry.
Thank you, and thank you to the two speakers. Just to remind members in terms of the history of this site. We did have a previous scheme which was refused planning permission last year, and the reasons for refusal related to the harm to the nearby conservation area and harm to a number of listed buildings. There were no other reasons for refusal of that application. Now, that particular scheme included a 26-storey tower as the tallest element, surrounded by 11-storey blocks, and that was for 657 beds. That refusal is now the subject of an appeal, with a public inquiry scheduled to take place next month. This revised application has reduced the scale in order to try to those heritage concerns on the previous application. Slightly reduced the number of bed spaces down to 620, but more significantly reduced the scale of the scheme. So the maximum storey height is now 17 stories, so that's 9 less than we had before, surrounded by blocks of 11, 10 and 8 stories. So fairly significant change in terms of the scale and density. Conservation officer now does not consider that there would be harm caused to the conservation area. There would be a very low level of harm to the setting of the 3 listed properties on Spring Road. So the level of harm has been reduced because of the scale of the buildings coming down and how you see those buildings behind the listed buildings and the impact it has on that setting. So we believe then with that much lower level of harm that the public benefits of the scheme do outweigh that, and that we can recommend approval to you compared to last year where we were recommending refusal of the scheme. There's a clear need, and we don't need to go through the details of that again, but just to make members aware that obviously the scheme, because of the number of bedrooms, would deliver a large number of units towards the city's 5-year housing land supply. Just in terms of the location, we've accepted that the scheme, because of where it's located, could serve the University of Birmingham, but also the BCU South Campus at Bourne Road, and obviously city centre universities as well. It's on a very good cycle route, a very good bus route. It's within easy walking distance to Five Ways Station, which obviously is just then one stop to the university. And just to remind members that the location hasn't changed, and that wasn't a reason for refusal on the last scheme. That was accepted. I think that's the 2 sort of planning reasons, but if I could bring my colleague in just to talk about the parking issues that were raised by the speaker.
Chairman, yes, mindful of the comments and sensitivity of parking and also the planning history, and that you referred to refused consent, which is the subject of an appeal, and the text within the current car parking guidance. The suggestion of the tenancy agreement is considered to be a way forward to temper any errant parking from visitors for the development here, and certainly the strength of any highway-related or parking-related refusals is certainly tempered by the text within the current SBD for parking. So there would be no further additional resistance in terms of parking here. Clearly, that was the situation with the previous scheme, which is the subject of the planning.
Thank you. Can I now throw it open to members for debate? Councillor Payne.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you to the people who've spoken on this. Just going back to the parking issue, really. Parking, as we know, is of a premium around the city, and certainly these locations are going to throw up these parking problems. So what we're thinking about here is bringing students into Birmingham, into the centre of the country, from potentially all over the country, to come and be students in Birmingham at our great universities. We're then telling those 18, 19-year-olds they can't really bring their cars, or if they bring their cars, then they can't park and buy their accommodation. That seems a little bit remiss, to be perfectly honest with you. You know, we wanted to encourage them in. We're going to then encourage them to use public transport. Yeah, that's great. But then they want to go back to visit their home, to their families. Potentially, we would like their families to come into Birmingham because it brings more economy into Birmingham as well, families visiting and everything. Again, we're then telling them they can't bring the cars, or there's going to be parking issues around the accommodation. So surely we should be looking at using accommodation where students can park more readily. Just an observation.
Thank you. Councillor Moore.
Thank you. Just to go with consultation, I don't think the University of Birmingham would have a parking issue if students didn't have a car, so I think it demonstrates that they do. And I think it's folly to suggest that somehow if people are not wanting to bring cars and you can somehow prevent that through some sort of condition in a tenancy, which anecdotally I hear has not worked with other schemes. I do remember this application last time it came forward. I don't think this is actually an improvement on that at all, really. So it's gone from a very tall tower to a high, dense block, dominating both the McDonald's next to it, but also the other buildings nearby. Particularly there's a block of flats nearby as well, which it dominates as well. So I don't think it's any more acceptable than the previous one in terms of the impact it has in heritage. I don't think the benefits it offers outweighs that harm in any way. And contrary to what was said, it's less than substantial harm, and we have to consider the public benefits outweighing that harm, which I do not. And I appreciate that wasn't the reason the last time, but I do question the suitability of this location. I understand Belgrave View opposite actually be decommissioned as student accommodation, but then we're struggling to get students in. Given that's directly opposite, I'm not quite sure how they will struggle, but this would somehow be successful in that. And whilst it may be accessible by public transport to various universities, it's not close by to one, particularly when you consider the application that was approved just a few moments ago, which was directly outside the front gate of the university. So I don't think the location is suitable. I do have a question, because I recall last time the university objected, and this is referred to in the representations made by Pre-Gill MP. There doesn't appear to be any representation this time from the university. So I know they were particularly concerned because it was not a suitable location.
Obviously, we'll take that. The officer will respond to that question. Councillor
Marsham, sorry.
Thank you, both speakers as well. Referred to what concept from the previous one, actually. So all the figures show that there is a need for more purpose-built student accommodation in our city, and it's increasingly where students rather live. The site offers density on the outer ring road, with several universities nearby. It has great cycling, walking, public transport links, reducing the need for parking, brings a vacant plot back into use. And whilst I appreciate that it is tall, it's actually a smart design and will not significantly impact nearby heritage sites. So I'm willing to accept.
Any other questions or comments? Sorry, Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, all I'd say is I'm just not convinced about the level of harm to the conservation area. Knowing that area quite well, I think there's still a considerable amount of harm. It's still a major development, but you know, I just say that over the years, a number of small impacts on conservation areas add up to a major one over time, and I think we just have to be very careful about preserving the character of that area, and this does, in my view, have a more major effect than presented in the report.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in before I bring the area planning manager in? Councillor Ahmed.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that. I think the parking points that have been raised by the committee members here are, I think, very important. So I'm minded to defer this item and bring it back to the committee to see if they can be tweaked and all the reservations that the members have can be resolved.
Thank you. Councillor Hussain.
Yeah, I do agree with Councillor Ahmed that the parking issue. It has been raised by the objectors and also by some. And I think that if you could further study the meeting, appropriate way to go about it.
Have a point of clarification. It's already a review this site. It's come back. What happens if we turn it down? Can you sort of put me where we stand with the current position on that?
Any other questions or comments before I bring the officer back? Please.
Yeah, thank you. So just picking up a few of those additional points, not sort of repeating what I've already said. Just a quick answer to the question about University of Birmingham. We did consult them. That's part of our validation criteria. They didn't respond. So if you're right, last time they did raise some concerns, but they haven't this time. They've made no comment on the application. Just in terms of the impact on the conservation area, that's been looked at obviously very, very carefully with our conservation officer, looking at various scenarios throughout the negotiations with the applicant. What scale did the proposed development need to be reduced by so that it didn't have that impact on the conservation area, and looking at all of the different viewpoints and getting those verified. And we have looked very carefully at that. And I'm confident in the advice that has been given by the conservation officer on that particular point. We've acknowledged some harm to the listed buildings, but not the character of the conservation area as a whole. And that is a different test that has been gone through. Just in terms of the ramifications, if you like, in terms of if members did not support the recommendation, we may have to bring a report back to you. It would depend what members voted on today, whether they wanted it refused or whether they were deferring it for further information. Because of how far we progressed on the appeal, that would still go ahead. So the only way that the appeal and the inquiry would not go ahead would be if the applicant withdrew that appeal. We can't withdraw it. That's in the gift of the applicant, and obviously they would have to take a view after today as to whether they would pursue that appeal. I would say that it would be very likely that they would continue with the appeal. We've all done a huge amount of work on it. Obviously, they have put forward this revised scheme on trying to address the issues that were raised on that refusal, and they believe that they have done that and have worked constructively with officers, which is why we are recommending that application is approved today. Don't know whether there's anything more on the parking issue. Paul?
Thank you. Just to reiterate, the relationship of this submission and that which is going to be heard in the appeal situation in terms of parking are no different in terms of the guidance that previously refused and this currently considered proposal is subject of. And so therefore, there were no objections raised by members on that previous scheme in terms of parking, to my knowledge. And therefore, this particular scheme, which also sits with the same SPD, would follow that conclusion.
Sorry, Chair, I'm just going to reiterate that in the sort of context of the appeal, that parking was not used as a reason for refusal. This scheme has less bedrooms in it, so potentially less impact in terms of parking. I think it would be difficult to sustain a reason for refusal, particularly at this stage on this revised scheme. It's in a highly sustainable location. The policies haven't changed since last year when you considered the application. So I would advise that would be very difficult to either defer on those grounds or certainly not to be suggesting a reason for refusal on those grounds.
I'd actually support that. I think that we can't sustain a deferral. That it's not clear what information you're seeking that isn't already in the report. I think we need to go on the report on the information in the report, which is very clear. I think otherwise you put this committee into some difficulties. So I'm not going to. I am going to put it to the vote now.
Chair, it's been moved and seconded that we have deferred.
That's a proposal. Are you wishing to push that?
It was my intention to have it after listening to all the members, committee members, that we have it deferred.
Can you state what the grounds are for deferring it?
Well, parking was one of the issues raised, and they are saying, the officers saying that you cannot defer it on that, on those grounds. But I think it is within our rights as committee members to defer it to see any further information can be provided to alleviate the concerns of the members of the committee.
I think if we're voting on a deferral, we have to have very clear grounds as to what we're deferring it on, and you haven't so far been able to do that.
Chair, I think very clearly the parking issue has been. We now as a town, in our patches, when we have this sort of a development, it do have an impact on this parking issue. And all we're asking if this can be deferred to the future meeting and then look at this seriously, see if we can come to some sort of a compromise on it.
Chair.
Yeah.
Can I suggest that we have a deferral to review the parking arrangements to look at what the impact will be on the surrounding areas given the concerns raised by the objectors, and to see whether, if officers remain with you, it should be approved, whether any traffic regulation orders are necessary to remove the potential parking impact that could arise from this, and also to review how the tenancy arrangements will work in practice.
I think the information on how the tenancy regulations will work has been explained to committee members. If you wish to, sorry, Councillor Marshall.
Chair, I don't think a referral wise. I think we either accept or reject the application. And if people are minded to reject, knowing that it then go to the national appeal system and it'll be out of our hands, and be for the Secretary of State to decide. That's how they want to have this application. I think that's where we go.
Okay, we're going to move to a vote on the recommendations in this report.
Moved and seconded a deferral.
There are no grounds being given to this committee in terms of why that should be deferred, actually. So I'm going to put it to the committee.
I'll withdraw the deferral.
Okay, let's withdraw.
The recommendation.
Can I see all those in favour of the recommendations on this report?
Five, Chair.
All those against? All abstention? Any abstentions? 2. That's it carried. The recommendation is approved. In considering item 8, which is the Marine Society and Sea Cadets, so just allow the officers to position themselves, and then I'll take that report. Okay, there are no updates on this report, and we have got speakers on this. We've got objectors Jan Kimber from the Midland Sailing Club and Bashir Ahmed. Address the committee. I think you understand you've got a total of 3 minutes between you. Yeah. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Good morning. Both organisations recognise the need for the Sea Cadets to build a new slipway that has a gentler gradient. What we are objecting to is the direction of the slipway, sticking straight out into the water as if it will create an underwater hazard as the water levels rise and fall. The report in front of you omits a key sentence in the RYA's letter. They are Sailing's sporting national governing body and responsible for ensuring all activities are carried out safely. They said, and I quote, "The area in which the new slipway is situated will have reduced depth, which will create an underwater hazard." I have copies of the full letter here for you. Paragraph 6.7 of your report says, "Concerns about the creation of an underwater hazard are not material in the determination of this application." This assessment misunderstands the location of the new slipway, which is part of the Edgbaston Reservoir Local Nature Reserve. The water is a valuable resource and as important as the parkland that surrounds it. If an applicant wanted to build a ramp in the parkland that was assessed as being a hazard, it would not be allowed. Parks Department has also not been consulted, and we know from our own experience that they would require a full risk assessment for structures being built on their land, and that this would also apply to structures in the water too. The reason the slipway's direction was chosen was because the applicant wrongly thought that the council was keeping the old concrete stumps after the demolition of the Tower Ballroom. Pictures of this are on page 4 of your report. This is not the case. And we believe a slipway parallel to the shore is a very good and safe alternative, which is what our slipways all are. We request that the committee defer your decision and ask officers to request that the Parks Department convene a meeting, bringing all stakeholders together and consider all options for the new slipway and risk assess them fully with the aim of bringing a compromise solution that is beneficial and safe for all water users.
Members, my name is Bashir Ahmed. I'm from a project based in Edgbaston Reservoir called No Ice. We have a national event held every year. Almost 20,000 people attend. This proposal will cause 3 problems for us. Where the boat turns, the slipway will cause dangers for the boat. Number 2, people who watch the boat race, they come use the dam as a spectators sport. If we move the race into the middle of the reservoir, the visibility will be reduced. So it's gonna reduce the fun and impact. And the third issue is that the distance from where we start the race, it will be reduced, making it difficult for us to move. So in line with what Jan just said, it would be good to find an amicable solution, combining all our ideas into one platform so that we can all work together in the same spot.
Thank you very much. Can I invite Howard Hughes as a supporter of the proposal?
Mr. Chairman, I was employed by the MSSC January 2021 as the boat station manager. I have a long history of both being a cadet and volunteer at TS Vernon and working experience as an outdoor tutor for the former Outdoor Learning Service, Birmingham City Council. Therefore, I know Edgbaston Reservoir well and its seasonal variances. On commencement of my employment, I immediately highlighted the issues with the current slipway arrangement. This was from a health and safety perspective of increased volume of use for employees, volunteers and young people aged 9+, risk to public due to time taken to cross the right-of-way, weight and length of our craft required to get our cadets and volunteers training afloat. My employers, the Marine Society, have recognised their obligations to their employees' right to be safe at work and carry out duties without minimal risk to their health, and have actively, with myself, sought to find a temporary then permanent solution to the issues I have highlighted. It is not feasible for us to use cable and winch system, as this would be crossing a public right-of-way. We cannot use a vehicle as the angle is too steep for trailers. Therefore, we have tried using an electric tug, which works with limited success. As the angle increases, the weight on the tug. Therefore, we have to use a tow rope, which again blocks the right-of-way for short periods of time. We have spent considerable time discussing with a number of contractors the best way to resolve this issue and have arrived at the proposed plan you have in front of you that meets the current legislation and guidelines for fabricated or constructed slipways. It's important that you understand that all options were considered. However, contractors were unwilling to fabricate slipways that turn at any angle at height due to the length and weight of boats involved. The proposed slipway allows us to connect the tug directly to the boats, which saves blocking the right of way for periods of time. It also meets the minimum requirements of 1 metre fall for every 6 metre of length, whilst fitting into our existing moorings and operations. It's also worth noting the slipway area is currently accessible to the public. I'd like to add that we have full support for this project from Birmingham Rowing Club, who are probably the most prolific water users. To reiterate how important this is to us, we have delivered over 800 individual sessions afloat during 2022. This equates to the current slipway being used at a minimum estimation 1,600 times up and down, launching equipment on what is our only point of access to the water. Following a recent independent equity, diversity and inclusion report, we are continuously looking at ways of making our offer more inclusive for users, particularly those with accessibility challenges. Our proposed slipway would support these efforts in a safe and practical environment. I also note that we have lost 10 working days this year due to injury. Thank you.
I'll bring the area planning manager back before I throw it open to the committee.
New material.
I'm sorry, we cannot take any new material.
The listing report, that's all.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to our speakers. I think a good starting point would be to look at the image on page 4 of the officer's report in front of you. So if you look to the left of the picture, you can see the existing slipway. Our understanding is it's very short for its intended purpose. It's at a distance about 3 metres and it's at a very steep grading, which doesn't meet industry standards. We have been informed, and it's to now, that users have injured themselves, and as I've said before, it doesn't meet industry standards. When water levels are low, boats are hauled over the reservoir bed. Again, you can see that with the picture in front of you. In terms of the replacement, what's being proposed is a 24-metre long slipway, approximately following the yellow line in the image in front of you, and this meets industry standards. In terms of benefits associated with this slipway, the applicant has identified it will allow boats to enter and leave the water throughout the year. It's easier and quicker to launch and recover boats. Increase the number of cadets who will be able to access the water. Easier for canoes and kayaks. Easier access for canoes and kayaks. And also remove the need to have winches or tow ropes to move boats, and it is understood that when such machinery is in use, the footpath around the reservoir has to be shut at that particular point. Ultimately, what's being proposed here is seen as an enhancement to the usability and the safety of the cadets using the slipway. There's been some discussion about alternative options. The applicant has identified that they discounted a number of alternative configurations due to the physical location, the reservoir overflow, existing adjacent structures and other safety issues. Also, a lot of discussion about the use and the different uses of the reservoir and how that's managed. I need to be perfectly clear, this is not a planning matter and it's not for the members of this committee to take into consideration. It's understood that recreational boating has a long established tradition of self-reliance and individual responsibilities. The Royal Yachting Association, which is the national governing bodies for such water-based uses and activities, have said they are unable to become embroiled in a potential dispute between our RYA-affiliated organisations. It highlights the need for, it identifies potential mitigation that could be put in place to maintain a safe operating area. I think it's important to emphasise that it's not for the planning system and for this planning committee to become embroiled in a potential dispute, and certainly not to regulate who and how such organisations use the reservoir. We need to assess the application which has been presented to us. There are no planning grounds to defer the application for discussions between users of the reservoir, which can happen separate from the planning system, nor are there any grounds to refuse the planning application. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from members on this? Sorry, Councillor Marshall, and then Councillor Ahmed.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you both speakers. I sympathise with the Sailing Club and the Bangladeshi boat racing, but there's no planning reason for me to reject this. But I plead, can all local stakeholders get together for the good of all those that use the reservoir for water activities so that it can continue to be used for generations to come?
Thank you. Councillor Ahmed.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think I agree with what Councillor Marshall is saying. It's not on the grounds of what the officer has just relayed that the Bangladeshi club is going to be affected. But I would like to point to the officer that we are within our rights to be able to consider what we like as a quasi-legal committee and not be guided on to say what we can and what we can't do by the officer. So I'm minded to have this deferred, like Councillor Marshall has said, for the better of everybody. So I would like this to be deferred and then brought back to the committee.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Jones.
Yeah, I'm not in favour of deferment, personally. From my point of view, we should be encouraging more and more people to get involved in sea cadets. I'm not a sailor. I don't understand how the lake is used. I don't even know this part of the city particularly well. But I'm pretty sure that, this slipway, which is going to protect, cadets from getting injured, they've already said we've had 10 days due to injury, the days lost. My attitude to this is clearly the sailing club and anybody else who uses the lake can get together. I mean, if you're out in open water, there's going to be hazards. They're there, you just avoid them. I'm sorry, they'll know it's there. So maybe I'm being a bit pretend to care, but I think you should go ahead and I'm going to
Sorry, Councillor Barry.
As a canoeist, I think I should, should be prosecuted if I couldn't notice a slipway coming down to it. Bear in mind it starts with a ramp, and frankly, I've got absolute admiration for anybody who could have launched a canoe or anything else off the slipway that there is at the moment. I'm not the slightest surprised that there were injuries. I certainly wouldn't want to do it. In terms of a deferment, I don't think that's going to work, because essentially what we're deferring is, why are we deferring it again? I mean, there are matters here. There's a dispute between the users of the reservoir. We're doing what we're doing as planners. We're encouraging people to use this resource safely. I don't see any reason for deferment at all.
Have some more?
Thank you, Chair. It's unfortunate this situation has arisen, because obviously it's never great to have conflicts between different users. So, and I do agree that conflict does fall outside of the planning system. It's not our job to determine who should use the reservoir or not. So, from my understanding of the reservoir, and certainly look at the location map, it's a large body of water. Whilst the slipway is clearly much more than what exists, it seems to me as a layperson that there's still plenty of space for other uses to take place on that. So I'm struggling to see that the conflict prevents other uses from taking place, and I do think that there must be a way for it all to happen in a harmonious manner, and I do hope that some discussions can take place to try and resolve that outside of the planning system. So, but I'm struggling to see a reason to reject this.
Councillor Payne.
Thank you, Chair. I have a mind to agree with Councillor Jones. We should be encouraging sea cadets. Anything that supports the youth, the youngsters of our city, we should be doing all the best we can to do that. And this is obviously a scheme which is worthwhile. My only thought is, and without changing the application or anything, as Councillor Barry said, it would be very difficult to miss the ramp, but potentially looking at the water line, potentially it might be. Is it not just possible, therefore, to put markers at the end of the ramp in the water so people know to avoid it? That seems quite simple.
The points have been made that it's not unusual in these situations where there are multi-users of a particular site for there to be issues of conflict. And obviously we hope that there are mechanisms there for those kinds of conflicts to be resolved. But clearly that isn't a matter for this committee. The matter for us is to consider the planning application before us and the planning grounds that are within that report. We cannot consider anything else, actually.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I haven't actually got too much to say. I mean, in terms of the markers, yeah, I mean that's sort of alluded to by the RYA. In terms of the comment about what we can and cannot consider, we're obviously here to guide and assist you in terms of what are planning considerations. Because if the decision was made which wasn't planning consideration, or if the waste was added to a non-planning issue, that could make the council vulnerable, the local planning authority vulnerable to a challenge to any decision made. So ultimately, we're here to help and guide members of the planning committee as to what and what are not planning matters. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, I'm going to put that to a vote. All those in favour of the recommendations to approve in application number 8. Nine, Chair. Any against? Abstentions? That is approved with the conditions listed. Excuse me. Item 9 has been withdrawn and will come back to a future committee. So we're now on to planning applications for the city centre, starting with the report number 10, Mill Street.
I believe we're going to take report number 11 at the same time as well for discussion, Chair.
We are indeed. That relates to the listed building consent. I'm proposing to take them both together because they relate to each other, and then obviously we'll take a separate vote when we come to the recommendations. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so 2 updates, and I'd also like to introduce the item because I appreciate it is a long report and it's raising a lot of issues. So just a short introduction I think would be helpful to you. So in terms of the updates, we now have the figure for paragraph 9.1, numeral 5 from the head of landscape and development for the public realm supervision fee, which would be £25,000. And secondly, the SIL figure quoted at 780-784-711 for is quoted at 1.7 million, but actually it's in the region of 2.1 million. Although you cannot be precise at this point because of indexation and the fact that we don't have the detailed floor space at this point. So in terms of these applications, so we have a listed building consent for works to the curtilage listed canal wall, and then we have a hybrid application for the overall development. The hybrid application consists of a detailed aspect that relates to the canal wall only, and then everything else is in outline. Although whilst it is in outline, it is supported by some various tightly drawn parameters along with a detailed design code. I think overall the report for you sets out the areas of policy compliance and non-compliance and offers up what is a balanced recommendation to approve. I think key benefits of the scheme worth drawing out are obviously delivery of homes, of which minimum would be 3% affordable, which although is fewer than we'd like, is without the scheme they wouldn't exist. Together with jobs, obviously the improvements to the townscape and the public realm that the scheme would bring, along with the economic benefits that are set out at 7114, including a predicted 44.1 million per annum into the local economy. Given the hybrid nature of the application, there are unknowns, such as the final housing mix. We don't know that at this point. And we don't know the detailed internal layouts of the buildings. However, as I've said before, these matters are controlled by parameters, design code. We will obviously have reserved matters that need to come along with the conditions recommended. I won't labour the issue of PBSA. already been through that today, I think. But the city's latest figures in Figure 6 show that there is a surplus of accommodation in the city centre in all but one scenario. However, the citywide position shows a substantial shortfall, largely driven by University of Birmingham. It's also worth noting that the Birmingham Knowledge Quarter Alliance have written in support of the application, and that includes Aston University and BCU, along with Bruntwood and others. It's also worth pointing out that a number of consultees make reference to a proposed co-living use. That was withdrawn from the application, so it's no longer proposed. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the net zero carbon ready in operation aspiration that's set out in the report. So net zero in operation is a position where the amount of carbon emissions associated with the building's operational energy on an annual basis is either negative or zero. And a net zero carbon building is highly energy efficient and powered from on-site or off-site renewable energy sources with the remaining carbon balance offset, although it should be noted that no offsetting is proposed here. We have a condition that requires a report at each reserve matter stage for a residential building that sets out how carbon would be minimised in construction and in the operation of the buildings. And then a further report is required prior to the construction of the buildings once the contractor is on board and they know the finer detail. In the event that net zero carbon in operation wouldn't be achieved, then this would be factored into the financial review that they have to do for the residential buildings at reserve matter stage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from members? Councillor Moore.
Chair. Maybe I'm just naive, but I assumed that the whole purpose of the planning system was to control development to meet an area's need, the city's needs in this case. And what we have before us is an application which produces an oversupply of one-bedroom accommodation, as highlighted in the report, when our need is for 2- and 3-bedroom properties. It also over-delivers on student accommodation in part of the city where we don't need it. It also doesn't provide bugger all basically in terms of affordable accommodation. 3% is pretty minor. I'm pretty sure Eastside 1, which is taller, offered more in terms of affordable housing than this from memory. It's also not even located near Curzon as well, so I'm not quite sure where the 8 minutes that Birmingham Live were reporting got that from. So, but Google Maps says it's 21 minutes walk. So, so it's not near Curzon. It's not delivering any of the identified housing need. So I'm not quite sure why we're suggesting this should be approved, other than the basis that it creates a landmark development. I didn't believe those two were mutually exclusive. I think it's perfectly possible to deliver a landmark development which also meets the city's housing need, rather than just creating more and more one-bedroom apartments, which has been identified already in the city centre and the city as a whole as an oversupply. So I'm rather disappointed because I had hoped this application would have been, I appreciate, it's hybrid. There's more information to come in terms of the full reserve matters if this is approved. But I expected more from this application to deliver to what the city actually needs, rather than just completely ignore that and what seems to be the case of developers just doing what they want. And I do think we need to push back on that and say, no, if you want to build buildings of this scale, which I have no issue with, that they should be also contributing to the city's need in some way, whether that's in greater number of 2- and 3-bedroom properties, a greater number of affordable homes, or perhaps in a bit less student accommodation, given it's not needed in this location as suggested. So I'm just very disappointed with this application overall.
Thank you, Councillor Marsham.
Chair, almost a thank you speaker. The scheme shows confidence in Birmingham as a place to invest, particularly following the successes of Commonwealth Games and arrival of HS2. It'll become a new high-quality landmark as you approach from the north of our city. The improvements to the canal and to be carbon net zero are to be welcomed. However, if they can't achieve this, then the number of affordable homes need to massively increase. It's great to be green, but people need to be able to afford to live there as well.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm minded to support this with the recommended conditions, especially that the car parking and cycle parking will be provided before the development is occupied. So I think that's a very good outlook for this building.
Thank you. Councillor Deakin. No.
Whilst I do agree that it's a
particularly, it's in keeping with the area and I have no problem with the look of the building itself. And I am likely to agree with you.
Any other points? Councillor.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to echo the points made. 3% affordable housing is immensely poor. One bedroom flats are not really anyone's aspiration. You can build a landmark building and have decent homes in.
Yeah, sorry to repeat what other councillors said, but I am worried about the one bedroom. It didn't stand out to me when I read the report, and I would ask that the developers rethink about their development with a view to perhaps meeting, as Councillor Moore said, the needs of the people of the city, which we clearly need accommodation that accommodates an awful lot.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments before I bring the area planning manager back?
Thank you. Yep, thank you, members. So in terms of the one bed accommodation issue, clearly is outlined, and that isn't secured at this point. It will be for a reserve matter to agree the final mix. But yeah, we're obviously factoring the fact that we've got two things pulling in either direction. We've got our own assessment saying that actually we're getting to a point of we have enough one bed flats versus our overall picture of we don't have a 5-year land supply. And therefore, it's very difficult to defend any decision on provision of the mix issue in isolation. In terms of the PBSA issue, so I think it's clear in the report that the site doesn't purport to be very well located for UOB, which is where the bulk of the demand is. But again, I think you have to look at the fact that there's no, well, firstly, in terms of the overall numbers, there's no guarantee that all the current applications will be approved and then built, of course. There is a need for flexibility in the supply of student accommodation. And of course, you can't discount the fact that just because somebody is at UOB, that they may not choose to live in a city centre location. And ultimately, whilst it's not the most accessible site in the city centre, it does benefit from improved transport links from. In terms of the benefits of the scheme, I think it's worth saying that I did pick up on this in the introduction, but clearly there are townscape benefits, there are design benefits, there are public realm benefits, there are benefits to the canal in particular, but also those economic benefits that come with the scheme, I think, should be underlined. And overall, I think it's clear that we've obviously assessed this in terms of the viability position of what's been presented to us via our independent assessors, and they're comfortable that this is the most in terms of affordable housing that the scheme can sustain, which is lamentable, and officers agree that 3% isn't enough. Hence why there's the review mechanism in there, and that draws in the net zero issue as well, because that comes at cost. That higher sustainability credentials of the development comes with a cost, and if we're not achieving them, then we need to open up the discussion again. Hence the review. I think that covers all the points, Chair.
Okay, I'm trying to gauge the feeling of the committee in terms of this, and I think that while people seem to be positive remarks about the benefits to the public realm and also the net zero gains, there is concern about both the size of the units and affordability, and on that basis, I'm going to suggest to committee that we defer the application to seek further, see if we can get further changes in the application on that basis. Are you happy to do that?
Yeah.
Can I see all those in favour of that deferral?
Nine, Chair.
9. Any against? 1 against. Okay. That is deferred. And presumably the next report is withdrawn.
The listed building will bring back with the other.
Yeah, so
think it
we'll
would
take that as deferred.
It would be sensible to defer both reports. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Fine. So on to item 12, which is land off Cardigan Street and Goxa Street.
Yeah, just one minor update, Chair, thank you. So there's a typographical error in para 7.14 in the 6th line, the paragraph. The words conservation officer should be replaced by conservation area. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from members on this report? You happy to move to a vote? All those in favour of the recommendations?
10, Chair.
10. That's approved unanimously. So we're on to item 13, which is a national planning policy consultation.
Thank you, Chair. So this report outlines the government's consultation on future planning policy. It covers three main aspects broadly: immediate changes to the national planning policy framework, which are due to take effect this spring, and subsequent changes to support the implementation of planning reform and the introduction of national development management policies. The report outlines the key issues raised in the response, and the full response is appended to the report. I just wanted to bring to members' attention the fact that this was discussed at Local Plan Members Working Group yesterday, and that there were a number of amendments to the response as a result of that discussion. So there's an addition to question 7, reference to specific issues with the 2014 household projections in Coventry relating to migration and student numbers, and this additional reference supports the argument for the move away from this data set and to using more up-to-date household projections in calculating housing need. Additional text in the response to question 10 to strengthen the request that local authorities should be able to refuse applications where density is out of character with the local area. Additional text in response to question 30 to request the government bring exempt accommodation into the planning system to help overcome some of the issues that have been experienced with this type of accommodation, and that local authorities be able to use the track record of providers of this type of accommodation in their determination of an application. Additional text in response to question 30 as well to distinguish between the track record of larger home builders where there have perhaps been issues with quality of product, and smaller householders who develop without planning consent. An amendment to the response to question 33 to suggest that local authorities should be able to define beauty in order to ensure there is a policy framework around it. Amending the response to question 34 to include a reference to early engagement with elected members and communities in preparing design codes. Amending the response to question 37 to place greater emphasis on the need for resources to be made available to address such matters as the use of artificial grass through the planning system. Amending the response to question 39 to add in a request that government consider bringing the VAT system for refurbishment in line with VAT of new build to reduce demolition, leading to protection of local character and reduced carbon emissions. Additional detail to question 44, further ensuring that the measures proposed in terms of energy efficiency don't impact on local character. And amending the response to question 50 to ask for a specific reference to CPOs in high streets to overcome some of the challenges that are faced by as a result of fragmented ownerships, and providing additional information in response to question 56 relating to improving standards of street lighting and ensuring safe access to flats above commercial premises, as well as adding reference to the safety merits of bringing exempt accommodation into the planning system. Thank you.
Can I just say on this, the deadline for submitting our comments to the Department of Levelling Up is, I think, a week today. That is a matter for the leader of the council. So this item was discussed at the Local Plan Members Working Group yesterday. If we have any further comments, we can actually forward them to the leader prior to submission next week. Councillor Marsham.
Just to thank you to Maria and the team, because I know it's a challenging national political landscape in terms of this in recent months. So what we've done today is well done to you, and I don't know MP's job you have to do.
Thank you. Councillor Moore.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just want to thank Rory also, because I appreciate there's a lot of questions that were being asked as part of this consultation, and obviously, and I appreciate the feedback that was taken on from the working group, which I sit on yesterday. So I appreciate that feedback being taken on board. So the one couple of suggestions I would make is I had realised, having reread the document, is it talks about allowing non-registered providers to develop affordable housing. And I think rather than just rogue landlords, I think we should include exempt accommodation providers in that reference as well, because I think there is a slight tendency that they may try and exploit that rather than just using rogue landlords. And then just going back to my comments yesterday around differentiating between householders and housing developers with bad behaviour, because it talks about multiple planning breaches. At a householder level, you may not commit multiple breaches because the likelihood is you're only able to extend your home once, for example. So I think we should just need to be slightly mindful of that. If we're saying it have to be multiple breaches, the likelihood is at a household level that threshold won't be met. And I think it should be around the deliberate intent.
Okay. I'd have thought those comments were ones that the committee would want to support, actually. Maria, do you want to come back on at all? No.
No, thank you.
Okay. We'll actually pass those comments on to the leader prior to submission of that. Okay, so we're on to item 14, other urgent business. Actually, it's come to my attention during the meeting that the minutes that were circulated to members were then approved have some inaccuracies in them. And what I'm actually proposing is that we essentially withdraw that approval, and at the next meeting we get an opportunity to agree the minutes.
Second.
Okay, thank you very much. So item 15 is the necessary authority to chairman and officers. Do you agree that? Thank you very much.
I shouldn't give you these minutes because they need to be checked.
Yeah, sure.
I'll give you these. This is from January.
Fine.
It wasn't without entertainment value.
It's more interesting.
Yeah.